Well, hello, everyone. I'm Aaron Johnson, Executive Director of the American Institute of Professional Geologists, and I would like to welcome you to today's AIPG Lunch and Earn webinar series. Just a couple of really quick bookkeeping things before we get started. First, if you need a CEU certificate for this webinar, it will be sent automatically to the website, or sorry, to the email address that you used to register for the webinar. So if you don't see that, double check and make sure that it hasn't gone into your spam folder by accident. Those are automatically generated through our web service provider. If you need CEUs for use in New York State registration, you will have to take a 5-question assessment test at the end of the webinar. That's a requirement of the New York State Education Department. It's not something that AIPG necessarily voluntarily would do, but we are required to do that in order to keep our status as a CEU provider in the state of New York. At the end of the webinar during the Q&A, we'll drop the link to that quiz in the chat, so watch for that. We'll try to do that several times because we know the chat may fill up. You'll have about an hour to take that. You need to get 4 of the 5 questions correct, and you can take that as many times as you want inside that hour to ensure that you qualify for your CEUs. All right, today I'm really pleased to introduce Chuck Drake as our speaker for the AIPG Lunch and Earn series today. Chuck has a BS from the University of Florida and 40 years of experience as a hydrogeologist, both, it seems to me, in the public sector and the private sector, currently as a VP with Tetra Tech. And Chuck, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about any of that. I also would like to recognize Chuck for years of exemplary service to the Florida Association of Professional Geologists and the Florida section of AIPG, and to let all of you know that Chuck will be stepping in as an officer for the national AIPG. He'll be president-elect beginning on January 1, 2025. Chuck, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for donating your time, effort, and energy for AIPG. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Wendy and Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. Aaron got things exactly correct. So I'll go over, like the cover slide says, the Florida water law, and then morph into water use permitting and how that applies to water use here in Central Florida. So just a few fun facts about drinking water here in Florida. 90% of our drinking water comes from groundwater, primarily the Florida aquifer system, which underlies all of Florida and parts of southern Georgia and Alabama. Well yields can run from a few hundred gallons per minute to over 3,000 gallons a minute easily. And we did some tests on some wells down the Biscayne aquifer in the Miami-Dade area, and that well pumped over 10,000 gallons per minute. So you can see the Florida and the Biscayne are very prolific aquifers in Florida. So Florida water law started, the idea started back in 1968 with University of Florida law professors, Frank Maloney and Dean Plager, and then Dean Baldwin as well. And I was talking with Tom Herbert, another long time and much older geologist than I am. Tom was in the legislature or legislative aid back then, and he actually helped with this as well. And these 3 professors were getting together, and it was part of the, I guess, concern of legislators, like how Florida's going to meet their water demands with a growing population that back then was less than 6 million people, and what's going to happen when they reach 10 million people in Florida. So they came up with what's called the Model Water Law Code, and that act and that legislation created Chapter 373, the Water Resources Act of 1972. So for 54 years now, we've had groundwater and surface water rules that Florida has followed. The Florida water law is a combination of Eastern and Western water law, both riparian and prior appropriation. So they took the best of what was going on across the nation and applied it to Florida. 373 established 5 water management districts, and I'll get into that in just a couple of slides later. One very important thing to note is that water, surface water and groundwater, and some environmental attorneys would argue that even the water in the atmosphere is owned by the people of the state of Florida. We don't have water, a person doesn't have water rights in Florida. They can still have mineral rights, and I know out west there are water rights, but here in Florida we don't. Everyone owns the water, and it's held in trust by the state and managed by the state. And as I'll talk about here in a few minutes, that's where the water use permitting comes in. The state will issue a water, or one of the water management district issues a permit for you to pump the water out of the ground or out of a surface water body. So 373 established these major sections. You have to provide, or produce rather, a state water resource plan, and it created the permitting of consumptive uses of water, well construction regulations, the management storage of surface waters, financing, etc. The one that was recently added was the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. So we have pretty much all of Florida's water resources covered in Chapter 373. So the 5 water management districts I mentioned, they were formed along surface water drainage boundaries. And I won't read all 5 of them, but the big 3 are Southwest Florida, St. Johns River, and South Florida. And I'll talk later about the Central Florida Water Initiative, which is pretty much right in the central part of the state. This is Orange County here, Orlando, and Osceola County, and Polk. And you can see the South Florida Water Management District goes right up the middle of the state. And that's the Kissimmee River, which flows into Lake Okeechobee. So there are several, or at least 2 big utilities, Orange County Utilities and the city of Orlando, that have to get water use permits because they're in both the St. Johns River and the South Florida Water Management District. So just south of Orlando, that's actually the headwaters of the Everglades. That's the Shingle Creek and Boggy Creek flow into the Kissimmee River, into Lake Okeechobee, and that spreads out into the Everglades. So the 373 also established the 4 core missions of the water management districts. And for at least 2 of them, their top priority nowadays is water supply. With our population now at 23 million and counting, at like 1,000 people per day, those water supply issues are becoming more and more critical, as we also have to protect natural systems, or as the water management districts have to protect them. And then flood protection, of course, water quality with our surface waters. So the water management districts are actually, especially St. John's and South Florida, were preceded by the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Program, the huge Army Corps of Engineers project that went from the Broward County north all the way through, like this illustration shows on the upper right corner, through the St. Johns River, Blue Cypress Lake, and up through the Brevard County. And this project I'm pointing to here is the largest completed environmental restoration program in the world. It's several 100,000 acres of ecosystem have been restored in the St. Johns River Basin. 2 other important facts about the Water Management District is, while they do get legislative appropriations for certain projects, that their primary source of funding is ad valorem taxes. So us property owners in Florida pay a tax to the Water Management District. Each district sets a millage rate, but the governor can have the governing boards raise or lower that millage rate. So the districts also get involved in the springs protection, like I mentioned earlier, and also help agricultural interests with not just water supply, but water conservation and more efficient means to irrigate their crops. So when you go to apply for a water use permit or consumptive use permit, you have to meet the three-prong test to actually receive that permit. There's the three big criteria of the reasonable beneficial use. You can't interfere with an existing legal use of water, not a legal user, but a legal use of water. And it has to be consistent with the public interest. So the reasonable beneficial test may be, do you meet a certain gallons per capita per day water use amount? Are the acre inches you use to irrigate a crop, is that within an accepted standard? And a calculation using either like Blaney-Criddle or what they call the AFSERS that the University of Florida developed. So each crop has a supplemental irrigation requirement. So if you're within that, then that'll meet the reasonable beneficial test. And also you can't pump so much water from either surface water or groundwater that another legal use of water would be adversely impacted. And then the public interest test, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there. The public interest test is a general test which allows the agency, when they're doing the review, to have a little more leeway in actually reviewing it. For instance, a water use may be reasonable or meet the reasonable beneficial test, and it won't hurt any other existing legal use, but it could be used for making illegal products or perform a function that's contrary to the public good. So the governing board could then recommend denial of that permit application under the public interest test. That one doesn't get used very often. So the water use types in Florida are pretty much the same as anywhere else. The top two are public supply and agriculture. We have some commercial industrial use, recreational. One thing to note on the domestic and small public supply, you may not meet the criteria to get a formal water use permit issued to you, but a domestic self-supply, say if you have a well in your backyard for irrigation or even for drinking, you still have or still protected under Chapter 373. So somebody else can't come in and build a bigger well. Did I come back?
You're back, Chuck.
Okay, I'm getting back on track here.
All right.
Okay.
Technology, you gotta love it.
At least I was halfway smart enough to not screw up and totally cut off. So you can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Do you know where I left off, Aaron, when you lost me? Was I under this slide?
Yes, I believe so. That looks right to me.
Okay. So I mentioned public supply and agriculture as top two water use types. They're approximately equal in quantity, although public supply just has overtaken agricultural use in Florida. Most permits are issued for a 20-year duration, but if you have, so let's say, a bond issue to pay for infrastructure, then you can get a 50-year permit. And two utilities and water authorities in West Central Florida over the last 5 years or so have been issued 50-year water use permits. And those permits are given annual allocation, annual total allocation, then an average annual daily flow amount. Sometimes it's a peak month and sometimes it's a max day allocation. And another couple of things to mention about water use permitting is when you submit your application to one of the agencies for review, they have a 30-day time frame to review your application, all the supporting documentation, and if they need additional information, they have to issue that request for additional information within that 30-day time period. And depending on the water management district, you have 60 to 90 days to respond to those requests. And if the district doesn't ask that request for additional information within 30 days, then by default, you are issued that permit. So having that time clock keeps the process going. The agency can't just delay your permit by not asking questions. So they're always under the time clock to get that request for additional information sent to you. And then moving into the statewide water use, and I'll look at one water management district. You can see in 2020, the total water use in Florida is about 6.4 billion gallons per year. The green is agricultural water use, and blue is public water supply. And those two are pretty equal through 2025, even though the public supply is starting to overtake it. And then by 2040, we expect to use about 7.2 billion gallons per day of water. Like I said, most of that comes from the upper Florida aquifer. And to get into a little more detail, the Southwest Florida Water Management District, that's over in the Tampa Bay region and the west coast of Florida. You can see there are a couple of very interesting things and how effective the districts have been in more effective and efficient water use by lowering primarily per capita and having more efficient irrigation systems. Is the total water use that was almost 1.6 billion gallons per year has dropped to 1,050 billion gallons, I guess, 1,050 million gallons rather. And the population increase has been pretty steady since 1982 all the way through the year of this data, 2022. So increasing population, decreasing water use means we're being more and more efficient with our water use, not just, like I said, conservation, but generation of reclaimed water for irrigation, for residential landscaping, golf courses, athletic fields, etc. So that was one of the big goals of the district, is on the water supply side to make our water use more efficient. And then going into the big issue here in Central Florida, the Central Florida Water Initiative started actually back in 2006 or 2007, which back then it was called the Central Florida Coordination Area. And a little sidebar on that is, earlier I mentioned that the City of Orlando and Orange County Utilities have water use permits in the St. Johns River Water Management District and then South Florida Water Management District. So they have to get 2 water use permits. Well, one district got out ahead of the other, issued a permit. The other one didn't want it issued. They wanted it issued concurrently. And way back when one district had filed a administrative hearing against the other district, and Governor Jeb Bush at the time got wind of that and really didn't like it. So he told those two to back off and instructed those 2 districts to work together. And because the Southwest Florida Water Management District over here in the west was also had adjoining boundaries, pulled them in as well. And from the CFCA, the Central Florida Water Initiative was born, and it became its own, or has become its own, planning region. These 5 counties, Polk County, Osceola, Orange, Seminole, and part of Lake counties all form the CFWI. And what the districts have done is actually created a collaborative water supply planning effort where the 3 water management districts meet to go over population projections, water demands for each of those water use types that I had on the slide. in the past, or excuse me, a few slides ago. They also include the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. That's DACS. Part of the review process and planning also involves representatives from water utilities, environmental groups, business organizations, agricultural interest, and the public in general. Each of those has input into the preparation of the regional water supply plan. And that plan, the first one was issued in 2015. It took about 7 years to get that far down the line. So in 2015, the first one was published, and it's been updated in 2020. The 2025 draft is being reviewed now, and that'll get issued early next year. And like I pointed out earlier to Kathy and Aaron, I'm coming to you live from this building over here on the far right corner. That's Lake Eola, right in the middle of downtown Orlando. And I think this is Volusia Blue Springs. That's a pretty cool place to hang out and watch the manatees during the winter time. So the CFWI formed at least these four working groups, or data monitoring investigations, are the water levels, going out and looking at wetlands. The environmental measures are how many wetlands are impacted, establishing minimum flows and levels. The important one is the groundwater availability, since we get 90% of our water from the Florida aquifer, is how much groundwater is available, or how much more can we pump than we're currently pumping, if any. So to go with that, right now the permitted groundwater allocations are 1,064,000,000 gallons per day. We're currently using around 800 million gallons per day. And you can see in this table on the bottom left corner how the permitted quantities of groundwater and surface water withdrawals are broken up between public supply, agriculture. When I said these were a 50-50 split, that was statewide, but in the Central Florida region, it's about 3 times more, 2.5 times more groundwater for public supply than for agricultural use. So keep the 800 million gallons per day in mind, and the 1,064,000,000 gallons per day in mind. So how have we come up with the groundwater availability? Well, the first model was called East Central Florida Transient Model, which actually the boundaries of that model were just outside the CFWI boundaries. And some of the groundwater modeling folks and others thought that the boundaries were causing, and we were having boundary effects because they're just too close to all the withdrawal points. So they extended the boundaries of the models out beyond the coast of Florida, and now it's called East Central Florida Transient Model. So it models the superficial aquifer, the upper Florida, and parts of the lower Florida aquifer. So that modeling was conducted they had baseline conditions, and then from like not 1995, early 2000s, and then going forward with those water demand projections that the CFWI plan came up with, simulated those withdrawals, the 1,064,000,000 gallons per day of withdrawals. And the modeling showed that if we continued on that path and would pump what has been permitted, then these adverse environmental impacts would occur in these hatched areas. This green is pretty much on the Lake Wales Ridge, US 27. Wekiwa Springs is over here. This is Lake Apopka. Orlando is pretty much like right in here. So with the groundwater modeling, if we proceed as we are proceeding, then these potential impacts would occur. So backing off on pumpage, they determined that up to 760 million gallons per day of fresh groundwater could be pumped. And right now we're pumping about 800. So we're already theoretically 40 million gallons per day in deficit. So the big issue going forward is if we can only pump 760 or at 800, how will utilities and other users get their allocations get cut? And then what are we going to do to make up that delta between the 1,064,000,000 and 760 million? So those water supply projects are being developed or as part of the CFWI plan. And this slide out of the 2020 plan shows the projects that are, I guess, not on the books, but have been identified as ones that can help meet current and future water demands without additional groundwater pumping. So the purple dots are reclaimed water. That's probably the biggest benefit. We reuse maybe 50%, at least in St. John's District, and Swift maybe 70% of the reclaimed water that's available actually gets beneficially reused. So that additional, let's say 30 to 50% of reclaimed water that may have gone to surface waters can no longer be discharged to surface waters. A few years ago, Senate Bill 64 prohibited the discharge of reclaimed water or secondary wastewater to surface water bodies unless it's for beneficial reuse. So the utilities are working to find ways to not discharge their excess water. I should go back and I'll amend what I just said about the surface water discharges. In East Orange County and part of Lake is the Water Conserve 2 project, which is an indirect potable reuse project that discharges around 25 million gallons per day through a series of rapid infiltration basins. And this area that I'm highlighting here is the potentiometric high of the upper Florida aquifer. So water that's recharged there pretty much flows radially out in all directions and recharges the upper Florida aquifer. There's about 150 feet of sand that overlies the limestone of the Florida aquifer. So that recharge happens within a day or two. It's been documented by the multiple piezometers that monitor water levels out there. So that's a huge recharge project, and I think it's permitted for, I just heard that number, well over 60 million gallons per day could be recharged. So again, the project, I mentioned the Conserve 2 is an indirect potable recharge project. Hopefully by the end of the year, Florida will have promulgated the direct potable reuse rules where we can take reclaimed water, treat it to drinking water standards, and either put it into the headworks of an existing water treatment plant, or it can be discharged directly to the drinking water system. And we'd be one of only the second or third state in the nation to have those direct potable reuse rules in place. So that can amount to another 500 million gallons per day of drinking water availability statewide once that rule gets in place. And a very important thing in order for that to happen is public education and outreach. There have been several successful pilot projects that demonstrated it can be done, that all drinking water standards are met. But in at least one of them, the media didn't present that concept very well. So the public thinks they're drinking poopy water, which couldn't be further from the truth. So once that gets published, that just kills that potable reuse project. But others have done it very successfully, and that will have an alternative water supply online within just a few years after the rule gets promulgated. So through this, the acknowledgement that our traditional water resources are pretty much at their sustainable limit. I want to emphasize too, we're not running out of water, but with all the constraints that that we want to protect our water resources, protect water levels, stream flow, spring flow, going through the modeling process to know that what that limit is, how much we can pump before those impacts occur. Um, we know what that withdrawal limit is because we want to maintain our environment, our natural environment, and have very little impact to it. So if we know we can't pump any more water, we have to find alternative water supplies. So the legislature created this subsection of 373 that directs the water management districts to find alternative water supplies. That can be brackish groundwater, brackish surface water, the reclaimed water, and now hopefully the direct potable reuse. And having that alternative water or that source of water identified as an alternative, then that opens it up for funding from the state government, either in the form of grant money or cost share programs, to get these more costly projects under design and constructed. So I'm going faster than I thought, but so if we have any questions, we can get to those. But just to summarize, Florida began permitting water use in the early 70s. So for 54 years now, we've had groundwater surface water rules. The 5 water management districts are unique in the nation because of their proven ability to protect our water resources, develop alternative water supplies. They receive the funding primarily from ad valorem taxes. And their biggest accomplishment is continuing to find water supplies to meet our growing population that, like I said earlier, is about 1,000 people per day. We're at 23 million people in the state of Florida now and growing like crazy. All you have to do is drive around any place in Florida and you'll see traffic jams, more roads being built, more homes. So these are interesting times in water supply in Florida and Central Florida especially. And it's good, pretty cool for us hydrogeologists too to evaluate the lower Florida aquifer, do concentrate disposal management. We're looking at injection wells in the central part of the state, over in Polk County, like in southeast Polk County, their test well is down 8,000 feet. And they found right at the bottom of that, at that 8,000 foot level, a quartzite gravel layer that will look to be a pretty good injection zone. But the cost for that injection well is $27 million. So these future water supplies aren't going to be cheap like our traditional fresh groundwater is, but that's the alternative that we have, is going to more expensive options. So Aaron, that's all I have. If anyone has any questions, just go ahead and shoot.
Chuck, thank you for providing a webinar for us today. I really appreciate that. If you're in attendance, you can feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll try to dig through those and see if we can get some of those answered. And also watch in the chat to see when the link is dropped for the quiz. Chuck, I'm going to start us off with a question that may not have a lot necessarily to do with the specific topic, but I'm interested in how you coordinate with the public and with the decision makers as part of, understanding how the management districts really need to work, identifying those priorities. What's the degree of public input, and how do you get the legislators and decision makers to buy in?
That's an ongoing effort. Each of the water management districts have excellent websites that post projects that are going on. They develop workshops, like say when the CFWI was first initiated, or the districts establish a minimum flow and level, they'll have public workshops, and they'll set up storyboards in a conference room or a meeting room at different localities, and the districts will have their staff there to answer questions from the public. And that's the biggest thing, is just trying to get the word out and get people interested. And it seems like every 2 years we have to re-educate legislators because you get a new crop of representatives in. So it's a constant education process up in Tallahassee.
Sure. I see we've got a question from Kate. Kate would like to know, what groundwater modeling program or programs do you use?
Primarily, the three big districts use the ModFlow code, and we'll then build it based on the hydrogeologic data in that particular region. I mentioned the East Central Florida Transient Model. That's for the CFWI region. The Southwest Florida Water Management District calls it the district-wide regulation model, but it's all ModFlow based. And the good thing about those two models is that us consultants can use that model to input proposed or projected withdrawal rates, and usually the water management districts don't question us on the model construction and calibration because they're the ones that did it in the first place.
Okay. I see a question from Saul. Saul says, in the slide that showed population versus water consumption over the last 40 years, there was a lot of annual variation. Is this caused by weather and or land temperature?
Primarily weather. I'm looking back in, I think 2000 was one of the, if you can see my slide, this 2000, I think that was one of the 1 in 150 year droughts that hit not just at Swift Mud overall, but here in Central Florida as well. So I think that's one reason why you see that spike. 2007 might have hit, was pretty darn dry back then too, from what I remember. So that's what pops in my mind to begin with.
A question from Ben. Ben asked about average precipitation in Florida and a rough idea of how much does the Floridan recharge on average?
Okay, I'm going to go from memory. I have slides in some other presentations, but on average, we're like 52 inches per year. Southeast Florida, Miami-Dade County gets over 52 inches. The Panhandle of Florida is around 60. If I remember correctly, based on those numbers, there's about 150 billion gallons per day of rainfall that hits Florida, and about only 10% of that or so recharges the Floridan. The rest is either transpiration or evapotranspiration. We only use and we use a small percentage of what actually gets recharged. That 7 billion gallons per day is a small fraction of what actually recharges the Floridan. But like you can imagine, you have concentrated withdrawal points, and they're not evenly spread out, so we get those drawdown impacts on some wetland areas. If I had that book handy, I could give you the more exact number. Was that close, Ben?
I think that'll work. I have two questions from Miguel. The first is,
which Miguel is it? Which Miguel?
Miguel Valencia.
Oh, Miguel Garcia works with me.
The first question,
give me a hard time. So
the first question from Miguel is, how does the groundwater flow modeling used in the regional supply plan account for changes in future climate conditions?
They're not doing that specifically. They're using like the last, I don't know, 30 years worth of rainfall data for averages, and just projecting that that average rainfall amount will stay the same. And actually, I had a note on my slide, which I forgot to mention, but they're assuming this stable atmospheric conditions and stationarity. That's the word I was looking for. They're assuming that, but they also look at some land use transition changes. So the runoff amounts, in another part of the district, they use some surface water modeling too, but they're looking at land use transitions. If we just go from pasture grass to homes being built, what's that additional or difference in water use going to be? So that'd be an interesting thing to do to, if they could figure out it will rain, if the rainfall is still going to be an average of say 52 inches per year, but it's going to fall in different intensities and different times of the year, how will that impact spring flows and lake levels? That would be an interesting exercise, because we for sure know it's changed over the last few years here in Central Florida.
I do see that the link to the assessment quiz is in the chat if you need to take that. And Chuck, I just wanted to follow up. You said the last 30 years of data. Is that a data availability choice, or is that a choice based on some sort of break in or change in land use or in climate, say back in 1995, be 30 years ago?
I think they've just gotten used to using the last 30 years or so worth of data. Let's see, part of that multi-decadal oscillation issue. And I was going to add one other thing. Darn it, I had the other reason why they want to use I know, when we're doing water use permitting, kind of this goes with the atmospheric or climate change too. They'll use a 1 in 10 or a 5 in 10 year drought simulation, whatever that rainfall or that frequency is. So instead of 52 inches, they'll assume it's only going to be 48 inches of rainfall that year. So they'll give you an additional 4 inches per year, say, to irrigate your crops because of that 1 in 10 year drought frequency. So on the permitting side, they do take into account some drought, but that's over the period. That may just be a period of record for any given rainfall station. So it may not just be limited to 30 years in that example.
Okay. And then the second question Miguel had was, what are the specific challenges and opportunities associated with using brackish groundwater and the lower Floridan aquifer as alternative water supply sources?
We're here in Central Florida, we've got 3 in progress now. The one I've been involved with since 2008. The Water Cooperative of Central Florida is in the final design phase for the Cypress Lake well field, and that's brackish groundwater. The wells will be about 50 cased to 1,000 feet, open hole to 1,500 feet. That'll pump 37.5 million gallons per day of brackish groundwater. We've done the injection well testing. We found an injection zone at about just over 2,000 feet deep. The one I mentioned a few minutes ago about an 8,000 foot injection well is about 20 or 30 miles to the northwest. And there's something geologically going on when you cross the Kissimmee River or the Kissimmee River Valley that they have to go 8,000 feet to find an injection zone. Just like a mile or less east of the Orlando International Airport, Orlando Utilities just completed a exploratory well for an RO for disposal of concentrate from their proposed brackish groundwater plant. That well is going to be about 2,000 feet deep as well, with an injection capacity of like 2.5 to 3 million gallons per day. So to answer your question, Miguel, the brackish groundwater is being evaluated. It's possible in Central Florida. The limiting factor is in finding an injection zone that'll limit the size of the plant or the capacity of a water treatment plant. If you can only dispose of 2 or 3 million gallons per day, probably couldn't build 100 million gallons per day brackish groundwater plant. So that's the concentrate disposal and concentrate management, especially in the central part of the state, is the limiting factor.
Great. Maybe two more questions. One, just from an account that says owner, is aquifer storage and recovery used and adopted as part of water use planning?
Yes, it is. And actually, it's in chapter 373, and it's in the indirect potable reuse rules as well. Florida was pretty active in ASR until the arsenic leaching issue, or arsenic leaching became an issue. But over the years, it's been tested that we can disinfect the water, so the potential for arsenic leaching is either eliminated or diminished. So let's see, over in the city of Rockledge, they were looking at re-implementing their ASR system, and Orange County has one under evaluation. The city of Sanford, just north of Orlando, does, and the Peace River Minnesota Regional Water Supply Authority has 20 some odd ASR wells that they use to store water that they take off the Peace River. So yeah, that's because of our water demand needs that ASR is being looked at in more detail compared to just a few years ago.
Good. All right, and our last question for the day is from Russ Patterson. Russ says this may be a redundant question, but how do you explain population growth and lower water usage?
The water conservation, with, like, you probably know, you buy new appliance, a dishwasher or washing machine for your clothes. Those are more efficient than they used to be. Low flow toilets, those have made a huge difference, and they're mandatory and for all, pretty much everywhere in Florida that use those low flow toilets and water efficient washing machines and dishwashers. On the other side, or not the other side, also is the use of reclaimed water for irrigation, so we can recycle that water and not have to pump groundwater to irrigate lawns. And then watering restrictions, say 2 days per week during the normal times of the year, and if the droughts really kick in, you might go down to a 1 day a week. And I think back in that 2000 time period when the water use spiked, over in the Tampa Bay region, you could not irrigate. I stopped by a fellow geologist's house over there, and his grass in his house and neighborhood was brown. You could only water if you had flower. Use a watering can. So the more efficient watering devices, agriculture, we went to microjet and drip irrigation, got rid of overhead sprinklers. So that increased the efficiency of supplemental irrigation for farmers and ranchers.
I'm going to follow up, Chuck. Did you observe that or have any challenges getting people really to buy in, getting decision makers to buy in on mandating those kinds of appliances, getting farmers and homeowners to buy in on reclaimed water? How did that work?
I'll take the reclaimed water issue first. Like when I first started working in 1982 here in Orlando, reclaimed water was just coming in. The purple pipe was just coming in, and the people didn't accept it. Moms were worried that, oh, if you irrigate the baseball field, it's going to get on my children, they're going to get sick. And so the public health department was wary of it, but they did all their testing and found out that nope, it's very well disinfected. You're not going to get sick. So as that public acceptance grew, then the water management districts actually put in it's a permit condition. Almost every one of, I think every one of them does have it, is you have to use reclaimed water when it's economically and technically feasible. you have to run purple pipes to new neighborhoods. So now the utility has that condition, then it goes to the county or the city to write an ordinance for all new developments that have to put in reclaimed water. So that gained traction, but it took years and years and years to get there. So now reclaimed water is like an afterthought. Nobody even thinks about that part. So Aaron, what was the first part of your question? I already forgot.
The legislative piece, right? If you're going to mandate these efficient appliances, how did that come about? Did FAPG play a role in that? Did you have to educate legislators?
We did. When John Arthur was president, and even that's when I first got involved. We go to the legislators and talk about the importance of us geologists and hydrogeologists, like don't de-license us. But also with the water management districts would have their staff going to Tallahassee and talking directly with legislators about, we've got water supply issues. There needs to be some legislation about how water can be used. So that's when 373 and each individual district really started tightening up on their rules and requiring the use of reclaimed water. They can't tell you how much to use, but they can tell you have to use it. But it's like I said earlier, it's been an education process the last 40 years of legislators that came from the farming or ranching background, or even utility people that understood I shouldn't say the importance of water, that's an understatement, that Florida's water use was growing. And if we wanted to sustain the growth, we had to reduce our water use and become more and more water conservation minded. And that just took years of education and getting the right legislators in there and requiring it's now Florida Water Star appliances, and it's just a long process, but it's obviously working.
Outstanding. Chuck, thank you so much for donating your time to AIPG. I truly appreciate it. I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you in Durango in a little over a week. And for those of you that are on, if you happen to be going to Durango, please make it a point to stop by and say hello. I always love to meet our members in person. A couple of other quick notes. We will have an AIPG Lunch and Earn the last Tuesday of August. I don't have that date right in front of me. That will be Tom Herbert. Tom's going to be speaking on the last Tuesday of August, and I've got a feeling he's going to talk a little bit about potential hazards as part of his presentation. So I look forward to that. Also, don't forget to take the assessment if you're in New York. That is in the chat. If you have trouble finding it, I think Wendy will probably drop it in one more time before we hop off. Otherwise, I really appreciate all of your time, and I hope you have enjoyed Chuck's presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you in Durango.
Wow.
Thanks, Chuck.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chuck. Look forward to seeing you.
You're welcome. See you, Wendy. I won't get lost, I promise.
I know you won't.
You'll have to tell Aaron that story.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that.
All right. Okay.
All right.
See you.